Systemic risk in today's financial services industry is a major topic of concern. Today I'm joined by Peter Chirlian, CEO of Armanta, to talk about what's wrong with today's enterprise risk toolbox. Peter, thanks for joining us. What is going on today in the enterprise risk toolbox, and why is it not sort of fitting everyone's needs?
Today the enterprise toolbox largely consists of working with fairly static reports, maybe with some ability to manipulate the information. And so the typical risk manager is faced with being able to read reports but not being able to ask novel questions and not being able to use their expertise and their intellect as best they could if they had tools that were more flexible.
Does this hold true for all sort of institutions, or are we talking about just the largest of the large institutions, let's say the sell-side brokers and the exchanges, or is this the buy-side as well as facing this similar challenge?
I think it's true for all sorts of institutions. I think the implications of the problems are worse the larger the institution is, because it's harder to wrap your mind around the risks in a larger institution. But I think it's fairly across the board in financial services.
Why is it so challenging for large institutions to grasp sort of the complexities of this? I mean, we've been talking about this now for almost 5 years about institutional systemic risk. I mean, the regulators are focused on it. Media is focused on it, CEOs are focused on it. Why can't we get this right?
The technology is reasonably well understood but hard to deploy. In order to solve these problems, you need solutions that can harness large amounts of compute power because the computations are very expensive. So traditionally they're run overnight, they create a bunch of numbers and then they run reports off of those. If you want to do that in a flexible way, you need to be able to do that on command. You need a risk manager to have a new question and be confident that they can get an answer to that question out of your technology right now.
When you talk about flexibility, I mean, what are we seeing in the marketplace with large institutions when it comes to this? Do they have the flexibility you're talking about? Can risk managers delve into a risk calculation, make changes to that calculation, or is it mainly just static and, you know, I get what I get and here's what it says?
It's traditionally quite static. There may be certain knobs they can turn, but they're quite limited in the scope. And the challenge in risk is you don't know where that next problem is going to come from. So the knobs that you think to create today that people now need to live with for the next 6 months or 12 months may not be the right knobs when something unforeseen happens in the market. You know, if your risk problem was very small because you were a small institution, you'd put it all in a spreadsheet because you would be able to make that spreadsheet do things on your own. You wouldn't need to engage a large IT effort to change it. But you can't do that with a large institution, with a large amount of data and calculation going into that risk exercise. So you end up with solutions that pre-aggregate values, that don't give the end user the flexibility to specify new calculations or to change the way they're looking at valuation or any other input to the risk process.
How prevalent is pre-aggregation in the risk modeling business within larger institutions? I mean, is everyone doing this, or are people walking away from that because of the challenges that calculations like CVA and liquidity risk analysis pose?
It's very prevalent, and I don't think you'll ever completely get away from it because I think there are probably places where it makes sense in limited use. But what we see today is that in order for things to function in at least a reasonable way for the end user, to get the performance they want, to get to the answers, at least in some minimal set that they want, pre-aggregation is the only way they can do this. And so that comes in a variety of technological forms, but there are all sorts of tricks that people play to take a big problem and make it smaller. Of course,
what are the challenges associated with pre-aggregation? I mean, I have my own ideas about pre-aggregation, and the challenge for me is when you start pre-aggregating all this risk, you start stripping away nuance, and in the end, risk is nuance. Understanding those nuances is what defines risk management.
Well, that's exactly right. You lose all the subtlety in the information, and so you bring it up to some higher level, and you've aggregated it along some predefined metrics. So if you want to look at something in a very different way because some completely unforeseen thing is going on in the market, you haven't aggregated it along those lines. You haven't given the end user the ability to work with it. You've also removed the ability to work with the most granular data, even for a mundane thing like data quality. So if there's an error in the data, but you've pre-aggregated that error up into a higher level, you're stuck. There's nothing you can do.
If I'm looking to try to solve or get on top of this situation, I'm on a large buy-side or sell-side institution, and I recognize that I have challenges, what should I be looking at when I'm looking at trying to solve this problem? Are there certain technologies? Are there certain methodologies? What should I be looking at to make sure I'm getting the most for my money?
I think that there's distributed computing. You need to think about that because just the scale of the calculation demands that it be spread across many machines. There's the front end. If the front end is not something that a non-technical user if a non-technical user can't use it to do very flexible things, it's not the right front end. There's caching that's probably a requirement because you're likely pulling data from a variety of sources. You don't want to have to wait on the data to be pulled out of the database. You'd like to be able to cache some of the data, some of the results, and then you'd want to have a solution that kind of holistically delivers all of those things so that when the end user has this flexible interface, it knows that it's talking to a distributed computing backend, and so you get this user experience that seems very simple, even though they're harnessing huge amounts of technology.
Well, it sounds to me like what we're really talking about is taking the risk manager away from being a report reader into someone who actually can manipulate data to understand the nuance of risk.
Well, that's exactly right. If your risk managers can't ask novel questions, then your technology isn't really helping them do what they're capable of.
Well, I think we're going to hear more about this as we move forward. I think risk, as we've said before, is here to stay. Peter, thank you very much for joining us today here at TabbFORUM.
Thank you.